that marks the 100th anniversary of the divide between North and South. So, for those that would be unfamiliar with how it happened, the divide between North and South Ireland, this video will give you an insight into the way it was conducted. This day 100 years ago, the Irish government was preparing to travel to London for a bout of knife-edge diplomacy in Downing Street, the results of which still resonate today. W.T. Cosgrove's government faced, of course he was the leader of Fine Gael. W.T. Cosgrove's government faced an existential threat 4 years earlier. 4 years earlier by Arthur Griffith, the leader of Sinn Féin at the time, and Michael Collins had signed up to the peace treaty with Britain on the basis that it promised the eventual achievement of what Griffith called essential unity. But for 100 years later, it's still in discussion. Article 12 of that treaty provided for a boundary commission to redraw the border in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, so far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions. Griffith and Collins, encouraged by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, Secretary of State for the Colonies, believed the Commission would transfer large tracts of Northern Ireland back to the south. The towns of Derry and Newry, and as Churchill called them, the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and County Tyrone. But in November 1925, a leak to a Conservative newspaper, referred to as the Morning Post at the time. Folks, for those of you coming in, tomorrow marks the 100th anniversary of the divide between North and Southern Ireland. So what I'm doing here is just giving you a description of how it happened. But in November 1925, a leak to a Conservative newspaper, the Morning Post, revealed that the Boundary Commission was due to recommend only minimal changes in favour of the south and the transfer of parts of Donegal to the north. Of course, there was panic in Dublin. The Commission was due to publish its report in early December. Cosgrove, his colleagues, believed this could lead to the collapse of their government, with no viable replacement. Having defeated the anti-treaty forces in the Civil War just 2 years before, they feared renewed violence. They were going to London to bargain for their political lives, and as they saw it, for the security of their young state. Much maligned in popular memory, the Boundary Commission had actually held real promise. Lloyd George and Churchill had argued privately and may well have believed that the Commission would be a further step on the road to Irish unity. Of course, that was conceived as an Ireland united within the Commonwealth. The Irish government appointed an industrious and determined public servant known as Kevin O'Shea to head a dedicated office preparing for the Commission. He did monumental work assembling the evidence needed to argue for that redrawing of the border. But the Commission was fatally compromised both by error and events. The first error lay in the rushed drafting of the short and ambiguous Article 12. Crucially, the Irish conceded that the British would choose the chairman. Ultimately, they appointed a conservative South African judge known as Richard Feetham, who interpreted his remit very carefully, very narrowly. It's interesting, folks, because it's still in discussion 100 years later. But the divide between North and South is still very much controversial. Still, had the Commission been established as intended in the immediate wake of the treaty, and with the oversight of Griffith and Collins, momentum may have made that move. But the Civil War forced its postponement. Meanwhile, James Craig, as Prime Minister for Northern Ireland at the time, reinforced its border and consolidated Unionist control. When the Commission was finally established in 1924, Cosgrave made a critical error in appointing Owen McNeill as his Irish representative. McNeill, who was already burdened with the role of Minister of Education, remained detached from the day-to-day work of the Commission. He took the stricter confidentiality very literally and failed to challenge key rulings by the chairman prejudiced Ireland's claims. Cosgrave would later dismiss McNeill during the talks in London as a philosopher who was out of complete touch. While McNeill was keeping his government colleagues in the dark, the Northern Irish representative, Joseph Fisher, who had been appointed by London because Belfast refused to cooperate, had been leaking like a sieve, as befitted his background as a newspaper editor. The leak of the Commission's final report may have been malicious. The recommendations turned out to be somewhat more substantial than reported by the Post, and were more in favour of the South than the North. In total, the Commission recommended transferring 8,000 people and 49,000 acres from South to North, but 31,000 people, among them 28,000 Catholics, which were about 7% of the Catholic population of Northern Ireland, and 183,000 acres from north to south. But by the time that the Irish government learned of the details, behind closed doors in London, the damage had already been done. The Irish public, expecting wholesale transfers, was outraged. The government was desperate to bury the report and salvage some kind of win to compensate for the failure of its commission. This had obtained when the British agreed to cancel the Free State share of the imperial debt attributed to the Free State under Article 5 of the treaty, which the British had calculated at £157 million. The report's remained secret until 1968. Amid the fraught negotiations, there were lighter moments and surprisingly cordiality between Craig and the Irish. He told them at the outset that though he was inflexible on the border, he would help you all I can to get as much as you can out of these fellows. Later, the Irish delegation gave him a lift from Chequers into London. Their car, of course, got a puncture. While it was being repaired, the Irish group and Craig strolled along the road, and Justice Minister Kevin O'Higgins asked Craig, who was the Prime Minister at the time, what his followers would say if they could see him now. Craig laughed and said they'd probably misinterpreted. This anecdote is told in St. John Irvine's biography of Craig. Craig suggested that the Dublin and Belfast governments meet every 6 months, rotating between Dublin and Belfast. But that suggestion was never taken up. Marred as the Boundary Commission was by both injustice and incompetence, the narrative of its failure can help to obscure an uncomfortable reality for Irish nationalism. the integrity of the identity of the Unionist people of Ulster. The nationalists of that era commonly regarded Unionist identity as a kind of false consciousness. They repeatedly claimed it would benignly fade away once an independent Ireland was established. That mindset remains living on today. During the presidential campaign, Conor Deegan of the Banfontaines, DC, said Catherine Connolly was the candidate of the uncolonised Irish mind, while Heather Humphreys was the candidate of the mind colonised by Britain. If unionism is a false consciousness, then the solution to the border is simply to remove it. Hence the attraction of a 50% plus one border poll. But if Ulster unionism is in fact an authentic national identity in its own right, rooted like all such identities in some opaque brew of ethnicity, religion, culture, political affiliation and geography, then simply removing the border would be to risk repeating the injustice of its imposition. There was an alternative approach available back in the 1920s. The longer game, that of persuasion, for all their hardline rhetoric, and it could be blood-curdling by times. The foundational leaders of Ulster Unionism, Edward Carson and James Craig, each said that they could foresee and would not object to a future in which Northern Ireland would opt for reunification with the Free State. Welcome in, guys. Tomorrow marks the anniversary of the divide between North and Southern Ireland, so that's what this video is about. Of course, many of you know the debate and discussions are still going on about it today, 100 years later. The key would be for the Free State in the meantime to prove its bona fides. Instead, Michael Collins sent the IRA to destabilise Northern Ireland, and then the Free State collapsed into civil war. Once stabilised, the Free State ceded power to the Catholic Church, precisely as Unionists had feared, neglected its Protestant minority, ignoring the warnings of W.B. Yeats. Gradually repudiated the treaty it had signed, gave itself a new constitution that leaned heavily into its identity as Catholic and Gaelic, and then abandoned the Commonwealth. A century on from the Boundary Commission, we are still debating the border in a binary issue. And folks, 100 years from now, that more than likely the debate and discussions on the divide between North and South will still be going on. A century on from the Boundary Commission, we are still debating the border as a binary issue. The long game of persuasion and the proving of bona fides remains to be done. But folks, if tomorrow marks the first anniversary of the divide between North and South, it probably will be going on in another 100 years when the second 100th anniversary comes along. Because citizens could honestly do what political representatives are supposed to do, but in the majority of cases they fail to do. So there's nothing stopping any citizen becoming a voluntary political representative within their own counties. While the others are pay, I hope their conscience are somewhat guilty for extracting money out of the state that they were never legally entitled to. And that is your county councillors, your TDs, your senators, and your MEPs. They are extracting money out of state funds that they should never be receiving in the first place due to the way they have been elected, which is uncounted votes exiting polling stations after voting hours, always covered up for what was already pre-planned in advance of these elections. Okay guys, that was rather long, but when it comes to the divide between North and South, it is an interesting topic with the way it has happened. It hasn't really solved anything over the past 100 years, tomorrow marking the anniversary, but folks, maybe someday it just might, but I'd be very, very doubtful. It's just a publicity stunt from so-called political parties, which are what you realise that there is actually no difference between independents and political parties, only the political party name. Okay guys, enjoy your day. Talk to you. Bye bye.